And we do that all the time. We're looking for the big things, I guess, maybe, or we're busy and we do it unintentionally. And yet the disciples, when Jesus said, okay, I got this for you, the disciples were like, great, I'm excited about this. I'm going to follow you. It's actually interesting. There's also another phrasing. It says, at once they left their nets. Okay, so there's a pastor, Rob Bell, who spoke on this calling of the disciples. And so this is not me, this is him. But I thought it was amazing. He talked about the significance of the disciples following a rabbi. Okay, so we're going to go into Jewish culture just a little bit. So Jewish culture, every little boy they were teamed up with a rabbi, and they thought that rabbi taught them, and they followed him around, and they learned from him. And as those little boys got older, the rabbis kind of started to pick through them and would say, you're not going to probably be a rabbi, so go do your father's work, and you're probably not. And so as time went on, working with the rabbi, these little boys were sent on their way, and it was their dream to follow this rabbi. But they knew that they could go do their father's work, and that was fun. Most of them became carpenters and fishermen and these things. And then there was always the 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of these boys that were kind of the chosen ones that would follow the rabbis, and they would be the ones that would then become rabbis and teachers themselves. So Jesus, right, was a rabbi. And all of these disciples who were out here working, carpenters, fishermen, tax collectors, these were all good Jewish little boys who had at one point had a rabbi say to them, probably not. And Jesus looked at these men and he said, you are going to be my disciples. Oh, the honor. They'd been rejected, and Jesus called them. Why would they wait? Why would they not move forward? Why do we wait? We have been called, we have been rejected. We have been put aside. We have things in our lives where we feel like we are less. Why do we wait when Jesus does call us? I'm talking about the little things that we have in our life as we move forward. I'm not talking about God's going to call us to big things, and there's going to be times where we have to pack our bags and move. But what about the little things? Why do we wait when Jesus calls us to the little things? We are called daily by our Heavenly Father. What's our response? Remember that fresh purpose? Remember the showbread earlier on? That showbread earlier on was fresh. We're called daily. Why do we wait? What is our response? We are so busy looking for what He will call us to tomorrow that we lose sight of His voice today. Remember, His purpose is fresh. It's new. It's something amazing. There's a few scriptures in this next section that we could talk about, but I'm just going to kind of tell you a little story about Paul. Paul was, of course, came, and he was kind of the pastor after Jesus. I love to think of Paul as a pastor. He was out setting up the church. He was looking for it. Paul, you want to meet a man who is doing exactly what God asked him to do on a daily basis? Meet Paul. If God said, hey, Paul, I want you to go stay with this widow over here, you'd be like, okay, great. If God said, hey, Paul, I want you to go minister to that person over there, Paul would do it. If he wanted to write a letter, whatever, Paul would do. Paul knew he had been so transformed. Remember, Paul was Saul. Saul was killing Christians. Saul was speaking blasphemous thoughts towards Christians, or words towards Christians. Paul was like pretty much as bad as it gets. Think Marilyn Manson. That was Paul. I'm serious. He was. And yet God came upon him, and Paul had an encounter with God that so radically transformed him that he knew without a doubt that God had called him. He knew God had called him to big things even. Isn't that cool? Like, big things. And he knew this. He could have gone ahead knowing what God called him to. One of the main things that we know that Paul was called to was to witness to the Romans. Okay, little history. At the time Paul was walking the earth, of course, because he was one of these people, this was the time when the Christians were being very persecuted by the Roman Empire. That's why the Colosseum, the whole Colosseum in Rome, that was built, and the Christians were thrown in, and it was a nasty time for Christians. But Paul knew these were the people he came from. He knew that God had called him to be a part of these people, to share his word with them. And he could have gone ahead. Yet he knew he had to wait. Even in Romans we read where he says, I long to be with you. Like you long to be with something, and yet you wait. But Paul knew he had to follow God. So finally, Paul's wandering around in the Mediterranean region, and he gets arrested because he's a Christian. He gets arrested. This is the first time Paul's arrested. He gets arrested, and he gets taken into Rome. And I will tell you, at the time that Paul was arrested, the law was so backed up because everybody was getting arrested. It was so backed up at that time. It used to be, just a few years prior, before Paul was arrested, they'd get the Christians, they'd convict them, they'd send them to the lions. Convict, lions, convict, lions. That was the way it went. Or whatever their punishment was, beheading. There were lots of different things, none of them very beautiful. But when Paul was arrested, they'd gotten so backlogged that it took 2 years for his trial to happen. This is interesting. I got this book. I wasn't going to actually show you these books. This is my newest favorite book. It is so amazing. It's called The Bible Manners and Customs, and what it does is it takes what was going on in history and it lines it up with what was going on in biblical history, and this is where this talks about this. So during those 2 years, they didn't have jails. They would just be put kind of on house arrest. They had to stay in the city. So for 2 years, Paul was able to interact, to be a part of the Roman people, to have a relationship with them. There's several places in his letters where we can read about him meeting different Romans, lives being transformed, things happening. God did amazing work through Paul in those 2 years. At that time, after Paul had been arrested that first time, he was put in jail for a little while. He ultimately ended up being let go that first time until he was arrested again, and then that's when he sat in jail and was ultimately killed. But can you imagine if Paul would have gone ahead of God into Rome knowing, okay, God, I know you've called me to Rome. I know that's where I'm supposed to be. These are my people. I have a heart for them. I want to see them saved for you. I'm going to go ahead and go there because I know you want. Paul would have been killed immediately. He wouldn't have had those 2 years with the Romans. At that time, they were being killed immediately. Paul would have set foot in that city, and that would have been it if he would have gone ahead of God. That's my prediction. Bible theology. Yet God orchestrated the timing so that Paul could have a significant time working among the people. Okay, the flip side of this is true. Had Paul sat passively, waiting for God to tell him to go to Rome? Okay, God, you called me to Rome. I'll sit here. Wait on you. Just tell him to go. I don't doubt that God would have still used him, but can you imagine what Paul would have missed? Can you imagine what the Ephesians, the Philippians, the Colossians, all of these people would have missed had Paul only had his sights so focused on the Romans that he would not move until God put him in Rome? All of these people transformed because Paul moved every time God told him to on a daily basis.